I'm Kyle Hogarth. I'm the podcast and Giants and Chest Medicine section editor. I have the privilege today to be interviewing John Murray, who, for those of us in the pulmonary world, probably needs very little introduction. Without a doubt, you actually have a copy of his textbook on your shelf if you're watching this. But we're going to talk about multiple different things. But first of all, Dr. Murray, thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So we always like to start from the beginning. So, you were born in New York.
I was born in New York and moved at age 5 to Los Angeles. My father was an artist cartoonist, and he did sports cartoons. After the Olympic Games in 1932, he moved the whole family to Los Angeles, where he shifted from sports to movie stars, and he did his cartoons weekly, King featured syndicate in the comic strips for the next 30-40 years.
Oh, wow.
So I was born in New York, but my mother, father, 2 sisters, and brother were all born in Los Angeles. So I consider myself a Californian, even though I wasn't.
And so then ultimately, I mean, that helps me to understand how then you ended up at Stanford then.
Yes.
I mean, it made a little more sense. It was otherwise a pretty large leap to go from New York to there.
Well, yeah, but I went from Los Angeles to Stanford. It was during the latter part of the Second World War. I accelerated graduation from LA High School. LA High School actually is where my mother went.
Wow.
Quite a long time ago. So there was a long dynasty linked with LA High. So I was able to squeeze in a year at Stanford in 1944, 45, and then I went into the Navy. I went into the Navy not long before the war ended. The war in Germany had already finished, and while I was in boot camp at Great Lakes Naval Training Station, the atom bombs were dropped and the war was soon over. So basically I had very little active duty, but the thing that changed my life was that while waiting a year for the 12 million other servicemen to be discharged, I learned all about electronics. I was a radar man at the time, and learned about the GI Bill and all the perks thereafter that made life very much easier for me from 1946 when I went back to Stanford through medical school. So it was the growth and potential, and the boomer age was underway.
Yeah.
Boomers were 46, 64. My kids were all boomers. It was a generation that,
right,
that we fathered, really, just chronologically. It was a good time.
And so, starting at an early age, I mean, did you know you wanted to be a physician?
I wanted to be a doctor from the moment I can remember being anything. I was very, very single-minded about that. I used to draw skeletons in the biology class and label things. I just was interested in not so much medicine as taking care of patients was, but learning about physiology and anatomy, and it got me involved in all the pre-medical work I could take on, and I was able to get into medical school after 3 years rather than the usual 4, and this was just after the war, when there were large numbers of veterans who were going back to try to go to medical school. So I think I was the youngest or next to youngest person in that medical class. It was a good one.
Did you get exposed to medicine a lot as a child? I mean,
No,
you know,
no, I had,
so
my father
teachers
was an
in the school?
artist, and my mother was a housewife, and but I was always interested in medicine.
Wow. So then ultimately, you know, matriculated on to medical school. Did you, what did you think you wanted to do? What was, you know, are you know, we just learned recently that Jay was a cardiologist.
Well, what did I want to do? I wanted to be an internist. I had, and I think these interests sort of cemented when I was an intern. I took a rotating internship at San Francisco General Hospital. Basically, by then I had a wife and 2 kids. We couldn't afford to move anywhere. Salaries were terribly low. So we just stayed put in San Francisco, took a rotating internship, and that's when I really developed a special interest in internal medicine, but particularly with cardiology, tuberculosis, and infectious diseases. That was a package that I was particularly interested in.
Which circles around the lungs, right?
Yes, yes. Well, that's an interesting story. I'm not sure I should brag about it.
Go ahead, brag.
I had 2 years of residency, basically, at San Francisco General. Then I went to Brooklyn, New York,
right,
where I was at Kings County Hospital, and I was sent there by my Stanford colleagues to team up with a professor at the time named Bill Dock, who was a fantastic man, a wonderful teacher. We actually became good friends much later on. But he was an inspiration to me. He changed my life toward academics and the implementation of scientific clinical medicine, if there was such a thing at the time. Wow. And Bill had big influence on my career. And I went to London thanks to him. He sponsored the whole thing through an American College of Physicians grant. And I did research at the postgraduate medical school in London. And that again was a kind of a turning point in my career. It gave me the opportunity to do some solid research. That's all I did that year. I didn't do any clinical medicine at all. And I met a lot of people who became good friends, still are good friends. I see them at the ATS meeting. There are not many old folks in that group left, but they're still wonderful friends that I stay in close touch with. It was a good start for my career. And then I moved from, at the end of my postdoc in London, I went to UCLA. I wanted to go to California somewhere if I could. That was sort of home base. I went to UCLA, and I was interested more in cardiology than pulmonary disease. My research in London was directed toward the cardiovascular complications of liver disease. Oh. And I worked with Professor Sheila Sherlock, who was one of the stars in scientific medicine, particularly liver disease at that time. And she also had a big influence on my career. We wrote an important article at the time defining a new strategy about how blood gas tensions and oxygen is affected by the presence of liver disease. So I went to UCLA, and I was interviewed by the chairman of the Department of Medicine, John Lawrence, and he said, "Well, I'm really delighted to have you here to set up our pulmonary division." And, you know, that was the first I knew about it. And I thought I was headed for cardiology, and actually started making ward rounds and joined the cardiac group. But I was told to be a pulmonary doctor. And basically that's what I became. And it was, I can't say it's the smartest move I ever made. It was the luckiest move that I ever made, because there were a lot of cardiologists. It was a booming field.
Right.
Pulmonary was on the dumps. Tuberculosis was going down, and there wasn't much to replace it at the time. Cancer of the lung was just really taking hold, asthma, COPD. There was no such thing as an intensive care unit at the time. So I got in at basically the nadir of pulmonary medicine. In fact, I took my boards in pulmonary medicine. I had to scrounge out some TB time to qualify to make it, which they were very generous in allowing. And I took my pulmonary specialty boards in 1944. And there were 5 people certified in the entire United States for that whole year. So there wasn't much going on in pulmonary medicine. But I took hold of what I could do. I got a lot of support from the Department of Medicine. I set up a lab. That was just a lucky stroke, because the cardiology lab, they were going to give me a little corner to use as spirometer. Fortunately for me, the cardiologist got drafted to Korea, and I took over his lab. And then, you know, I just went on. I had a good career. I learned a lot about pulmonary medicine in a hurry. And in those days, really, everyone older than 40 was a tuberculosis specialist, and there weren't many people any younger than me, and I can't remember, I was 28 or 30, something like that. So the field was just getting going, and the new field of lung disease. Right. And I was there at the time, Jay was a partner of mine. I have known Jay since, well, he came to the CVRI in 58. I went to UCLA in 57. And within a few years, we were on committees together because we were the only pulmonary guys around. And so we had a long partnership and a very fortunate, good one for everybody, I think. So with this small group, there aren't many of them left now, but in the 60s, I had taken up with Julius Comro by then. I'd moved from UCLA to UCSF, was a member of the Cardiovascular Research Institute. My headquarters were at San Francisco General Hospital, where I set up the clinical arm of the CVRI training program. So I had a clinical rotation for a year, and then the CVRI science part kicked in for anywhere from 1 to 3 years. That's what Jay mentioned, that together we had this clinical research training program that trained most of the good pulmonary physicians at the time in San Francisco. It was a wonderful partnership that paid off enormously.
You guys were the first translational researchers.
I think.
That's the buzzword these days, right?
Yeah. And that's what Jade mentioned, that he and I were partners, greatly aided and abetted by Julius Comro. Jay and I helped Julius. We wrote things under his name to try to foster interest in pulmonary medicine. And Julius thought that cardiologists could be a good home for pulmonary medicine, but we thought differently. And in fact, Julius helped create the lung component of the Heart Institute. And we had a reasonable influence on that. But the thing that also came out of this that Jay talked about, that in the textbook we did, what we were interested in, what Julius Conroe basically lived his life for, was the marrying of science and clinical medicine, and that's what we did. That's basically how we've lived the last 40 years.
I'm always fascinated at mentorship and also at the same time taking a hold of chance opportunities. I mean, so you were in California and you were at Stanford, and they said you should go to Brooklyn for some time.
Yeah. I was sent to Brooklyn by the head man at San Francisco General Hospital, Jake Lewis.
Said, "This is
My
an
adored.
opportunity,
It was
you
an
go."
old pal of Bill Doc's.
Wow. I mean, and that obviously opened up things for you. Then that's how
Absolutely.
you got to London.
Absolutely.
And then it's a fascinating thing. I love the story of arriving thinking you're about to be a cardiologist in LA and say, congratulations, you're doing pulmonary.
I was appointed a pulmonary doctor. It really was. I had very little to do with it.
Wow. So it's fascinating to me because the amount of work and effort that would be involved in putting together a textbook, and in particular one from the first edition, essentially from scratch.
It was from scratch. I can't remember. It was published in '84, '86, something like that. You should have the date.
Yeah.
The first edition.
I think the workload had to be incredible to make that happen.
Well, Jay and I shared things. He did the science part, I did the clinical medicine part, but I also was very interested in sort of the organization, the integration. I did all the page proofs. I tried to help people set up the figures and legends. I wrote the index for one of the editions.
Right.
So I was very deeply involved in that because I felt very strongly about it. Jay was very much a partner in all of that.
Your career has obviously had lots of different accomplishments, and without a doubt, your textbook is clearly a pinnacle of and one of your, I think I would assume you're quite proud of.
Well, yes, I'm very proud of it.
But what other things would you highlight as some of your accomplishments that you're most proud of?
Well, I think it started out again in the early years of pulmonary medicine. It had to be in the 70s. Again, the group of young pulmonary physicians was very small. This was maybe 20 maximum of people that really helped put new pulmonary medicine on the map. And Jay and I, with 3 or 4 others, were very much part of changing the ground rules for pulmonary medicine. And we basically tried to unseat what we called the old farts, the old TB docs that were at least a generation older than we were, and so there was a big gap in age. So the young groups, the young Turks, got a foothold in the administration. I was chairman of the nominating committee that nominated Alan Pierce first and then Jay Nadell second in the lineup of presidencies. Alan was very close to the two of us, long dead, unfortunately. But that allowed, and we developed the scientific sections of the assemblies that hadn't been there before. It was all TB committees and stuff, and a lot of that work in those days was done through the American Lung Association. And we did not like the American Lung Association at all because it was always interfering. It was the boss. The ATS was a subsidiary part of the ALA, and that caused a lot of strife. But at that time, when Alan and Jay became president, I became editor of the then American Review of no, it's not the American Review of Tuberculosis, and it was the American Review of TB and lung disease. It has had several incarnations.
Right.
And I loved that. I thought that was very important work, and we had basically a CVRI editorial board. Jay was part of it, of course. Julius Comro was part of it. John Clements and Phil Hopewell joined us a year or so later. And I find it interesting that the assembly on tuberculosis that became part of the overall editorial operation, and they insisted that I not be have anything to do with tuberculosis, which in fact I grew up with. I know quite a lot about tuberculosis. Yeah. So that was Manny Walensky, and he played his role fine, and collectively we had a good run. But we made many changes. The journal just was totally different from the old TB journal that it had. It had new medicine, new pulmonary medicine from beginning to end. And so I had a lot to do with that, which I'm very proud of, I think, because that was a big change in pulmonary medicine. About that time, I think I told you, the specialty board exams, there were 5 of us who passed. And then the interest in pulmonary medicine within the next few years just shot up to hundreds of people per year. It was an enormous impact on it wasn't just us, it was the subject matter that people were interested in. It was all new and different and interesting.
New areas to explore.
Yeah,
that's always
absolutely.
Bring in a lot of fresh minds.
Yeah, well, we had pulmonary function. I spent a lot of time with pulmonary function through Julius and Jay. We were all partners in this. But there was also the beginning of intensive care. I founded the intensive care unit at San Francisco General Hospital, a medical part. There had been a surgical element. And that became one of my deep interests. I ran the ICU. I founded it and ran it for, I don't know, 40 years or so. Wow. So I had a lot of interest in acute critical care medicine, and it fit right in with my clinical interest of physiology. That's sort of the underlying pin of my professional career, was trying to understand basic pulmonary physiology and make use of it in clinical pulmonary disease. And that's the marriage that I've lived with.
Right. Now you've spent a lot of your, some of your professional time and a lot of your personal time in France. Can we talk about how that came to be?
Yes, I started my career in France essentially the year before I went to France. I had a fellow from France, a graduate student, who came to San Francisco to work with me. His name was Gerard Houchon, who's now a professor of medicine, critical care, one of the major hospitals in Paris. And he lived with us for a while. He was getting settled. His wife and kid moved over, and but we got together with him, and we became very close. So just good friends. His wife, for example, became my wife's his daughter's. My wife became her godmother. Things like that. It was just close relationship. So we were making good headway. We were studying the effect of using inhaled radioactive substances to track their clearance as they left the lungs, and we were hoping that would be a way of determining acute lung injury as an early feature of the injury to the epithelium, alveolar capillary bed in the lungs. And we were making good progress. We'd already written a couple of papers with Gerard that first year, and I had a sabbatical leave coming up, so I went to Paris after he finished his year, I followed the following year in the lab that one of his pals, senior person, had assigned me to, really, and again, that worked. It just worked out. We became very good friends. Gerard's professor at Lanek Hospital gave him 2 days off a week to go to the lab I was working in, so we could continue our work together. And again, that was a very profitable work. We got some good papers, good science out of it, and it was just at that time that there was this interest in combining French medicine with U.S. medicine, and there was actually a collaborative grant from the two countries that I got one of the first legs into. So, and it was then about then, a few years later, that Julius Comro set up the first what was called a SCORE grant, and I had one of the major sections in clinical pulmonary medicine, and we paired up with Norman Staub, who was doing the physiology and the anatomy, and again, that worked out very well. But Gerard got his summers off from Paris, and he and his family came back to San Francisco, and we had basically a 2 or 3 month crash program of doing research. I got it all set up with the technicians and the facilities and the money and everything, and Gerard would come and act it out, make it happen. And again, that was a very good partnership that lasted till he became full professor, and didn't have time to do that anymore, but we had a good 10, maybe 12, 13 years of research together in Paris. And I was, because of the SCORE grant, I could go to Paris at least once a year to work with Gerard, and he came to me once a year, and I got another sabbatical, 89, 90, I think, and that was a big change in my life. Gerard and I had finished our work largely because he had many other things to do, and I had changed my orientation and went back to my first love, which was tuberculosis. And that was in the early 80s. I can tell you exactly when it was. It was 1982. When the first paper from the CDC came out announcing or spotting 8 or 10 patients with pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. A few months later, there were some patients with Kaposi sarcoma. And the New England Journal had an editorial, and I think a year later, I rallied all the major centers, pulmonary centers that had experience with AIDS, and we got, with the NIH help, I wrote the first paper announcing the importance of lung disease as one of the major clinical manifestations of AIDS, and I actually did that, make a couple of series. But I organized all that. I had the idea, and with the NIH's help, Sue Hurd made it happen, and it was a very useful, I think, and it set the stage for all those early studies of AIDS and lung disease. It was a revealing experience, and I was asked, I don't know, a couple of years ago, to write a thing about the epidemiology of pulmonary medicine and AIDS. And it was very interesting to me in that I knew all about AIDS from 1982 to when I finished clinical medicine at San Francisco General Hospital. And then I changed my routine started living in France, 1984, which was when I officially retired. And then
84 or 94?
I'm sorry,
94.
94.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, 94. And I started work with a French group looking at the clinical manifestations of AIDS and tuberculosis in sub-Saharan Africa. So I started a program with a Fogarty grant at the NIH, and then it was appended really to a grant sponsored by the French government. And we had basically the same protocols, but I spent a lot of time in Burundi and then Tanzania. We tried to partner these, the countries are side by side.
Yeah.
Burundi is French-speaking, English for Tanzania. So I spent a lot of time in and out of those two countries. And it was work I am proud of, because it was the first time that we could really put some numbers on these relationships that were proved to be extremely important.
This is what you did in your retirement.
Yes. This is, yeah. And during those retirement years, I quit the French Sub-Saharan Africa Partnership maybe in 2008, somewhere around there, plus or minus a couple of years. But I kept 3 months aside every year to go back to San Francisco, where I continued to run the ICU at San Francisco General Hospital. And I did that the time began to shorten. At first I did it for 2 months, and then I did it for 6 weeks, and then I had two. I tell you, I was getting to be old then. I'm ancient now, and it is tough work.
Yeah.
And I really, I got so I didn't think I could do it anymore, just because of the fatigue and stress that came along with the job.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting to hear both the evolution of our field and even your career, sort of TB's dying off, it's waning, new pulmonary, if you will, all the new, quote, new diseases, to then see it circle right back, and
That's
sort of the end of your career, you're boom, knee deep in tuberculosis again.
That's exactly the sequence, and I find it fascinating. I'm still not a bad chest physician, and I work in Paris. I have an appointment at the International Union Against Tuberculosis and Lung Disease. I was president of it, I can't remember, 92, 94, something like that. It was a very small organization devoted to tuberculosis in low-income countries, which was part of what I was doing thereafter in sub-Saharan Africa. But now the IUA-TLD has just grown and blossomed and reached out in other disciplines and has millions of dollars, which we never saw a sight of at the time. But I'm still devoted to the IUA-TLD. I'm on their associate editorial board, and I go to the IUA-TLD office in Paris. My wife wants me out of the apartment, and I like going there because they're colleagues, and I do a lot of editorial work, but that's where I work on the book I'm presently finishing. So.
The next edition?
No, that's we've built in, and that's almost done now. No, I have been trying for years to write a book about aging, and basically it's finished. I had it finished a couple of years ago. There was an offer for publishing, and it fell through, so I decided I would do two things. One, I had to update it because it took so long to figure out to get a rejection finally, that I had to update it again because all the facts change. It's a dynamic field.
Right.
Then I decided I would self-publish it. And that's what we're in the process of doing. I have an assistant who's helping me. It's not an easy job either.
I bet not.
But it's a lot of fun. I've enjoyed learning about aging, actually. It's an interesting subject. And, you know, I'm among the oldest old these days. And so I again, it's a good aside for me. But Jay knows this as well as I think particularly me. I'm slowing down. I can't do what I used to, and it's harder, and it takes longer. And so I'm glad to be reminded of the old folks that had something to offer 20 years ago.
There's, a lot of the people that watch this are going to be very young in their careers, and as always, it seems very important that there's a significant amount of mentorship. So I'm curious what advice you would give for people that want to have a long and productive career, maybe pearls that you've picked up to help.
Well, I have a ready answer for that.
Yeah.
And it comes from a statement that Julius Comro, again, Julius Comro was sort of made JC, fabulous man, changed our lives and pulmonary medicine with it. Julius used to say that when fellows looking for jobs would ask the question, he would say, "What do you see yourself doing 5 years from now? What is your goal 5 years from now? And if you know what that is, go to it. Don't get people, don't do things deliberately because jobs are open this year. You have this goal, and you have to make that circuit and make it happen because that's what you want to do. It's not what your preceptors or your faculty members, your superior in academic medicine want to do. It's what you want to do. And I think that's pretty good advice. It's very hard to do now. It's really hard to do. And I didn't hear Jay talk all about this, but I think he and I and the group that I worked with at the time, our age group, we were really, really lucky. There were only a few of us. There was a lot of money. You could get grants, you could get help. Comro supervised it all, told us what to do, and made it happen. And it was, the life we lived then is totally different from a young academic aspiring pulmonary physician today. It's just totally different.
Yeah.
And it's hard to I can't tell somebody, some young fellow, what to do because the way I did it was so different from the way it has to be now. I'm serious about that.
Oh. Well, anything during your career that you would change?
Well, I'm glad I didn't become a cardiologist because that set me on a path of fabulous career-enhancing opportunities.
That's great. Is there anything we haven't discussed or anything that I haven't brought up that you want to talk about?
Well, I just want to put in one thing.
Please.
And that's a plug for my wife.
Okay.
My wife is a writer named Diane Johnson, and she's a good writer. She's very well known. She writes fiction and has just published a book a few months ago. It's doing well in the Times listing. She is very much a part of the New York Review of Books and writes articles for them 2 or 3 times a year. Is very well known for that work. But she has helped me. And I help her do literary stuff, but she's really good at it. I'm an amateur, but we've sort of partnered some of these things. And the title of my book, How Aging Works, comes from her, and things like that. And I just want to thank her.
I think that's great. Like you said, a lot of your work, it's about a partnership, and it sounds like that partnership begins at home.
Oh, absolutely. We've been married 45 years now, and
Congratulations.
it's a good partnership there too.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today. This was perfect. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.